When most people think about military industries or defence exports, I'm convinced they generally think of the big players, the United States, China, Russia, countries like that. In my previous videos, I've mostly talked about major military powers. I've talked about Chinese military modernisation, or the US defence production advantage, and Russia's history in the arms export market. And one thing that I hope has come through is the importance of scale and expertise in defence manufacturing. The larger your industrial base and the larger a military that you support and the more advanced that military is, the more likely you are to have an affordable world-beating product, thus dominate the export markets, which just gives you more scale and more opportunities to improve your product and further dominate the market. It's those factors that explain, for example, why the United States can get the acquisition cost of something like the F-35 down to the initial acquisition cost of a much less capable platform like the Saab Gripen. So having done a little bit of cheerleading for American and Chinese industry, I thought today might be a good time to talk about shipbuilding, particularly ship and submarine building for the arms market. After all, the United States Navy is widely acknowledged as the most powerful in the world. The Chinese have the fastest growing and largest navy in terms of number of hulls and gross tonnage, and Russia has its own relatively storied naval history that peaked in the late days of the Cold War. These are countries that do or have done shipbuilding at scale. They are countries with massive technological expertise and experience in producing warships and submarines. So it might shock you to hear that between the years 2017 and 2021 inclusive, none of these nations topped the charts for countries that were most successful in exporting their naval hardware abroad. In fact, in the last half-decade, none of these powers even made it into the top 5 exporter list. No, those slots were reserved for real global powers. You know, secret military superpowers like Italy or the Netherlands. Between 2017 and 2021, based on SIPRI trend indicator values, NATO allies the Netherlands and Spain booked individually twice as many orders as the United States did for arms exports in terms of ships and submarines. Non-NATO ally, the Republic of Korea, managed more than 3 times. And given that the United States, China, and Russia are all meant to have powerful navies and established shipbuilding sectors, I thought this might be a topic worth discussing. Are there industrial factors at play, or should we be worried about a new Spanish Armada and an Italian declaration of Mare Nostrum? So what am I going to be talking about today? Well, I'll give a quick overview of the naval arms export market. That is the market for entire ships and submarines, not for individual weapon systems or sensors. And I'm going to be basing that primarily on SIPRI data, as I usually do when it comes to arms trade. I'll look at some of the major players in this space, what are their product offerings, what are examples of some of their recent sales, and in so doing maybe shed some light on why it seems at least that the major powers are being outcompeted. Some caveats as always. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute data that I use to underpin this is probably the best data out there on arms transfers, but it's not perfect. After all, the arms market is a complicated thing, and it's hard for a simple register that tracks country of origin, country of delivery, system type and value to capture all of those nuances. For example, license production, cost calculations, attribution on joint projects, all of these can complicate what the trade registers that SIPRI uses try and do. The data also struggles a bit when it's dealing with joint projects and companies. Most defence prime contractors are massive multinational conglomerates who produce components and materials in various countries around the world, so attributing a sale to one country may sometimes overly simplify the story. I'll also say that I don't have time to look at all producers, so instead I've selected a subset of countries that export ships and submarines that I think will be interesting. This video is probably going to be long enough without having to look at every single producer on the list, so if you're left out in advance, I apologise. So let's give a top-level overview of the export market for ships and submarines. And in order to help us do this, I thought it'd be fun to take on a little bit of a scenario to help us guide our thinking. So for the purpose of this episode, congratulations, Mr. President. We are the newly elected president of a newly created state. We have a developed economy, but we have no established political or diplomatic loyalties out there, and we're looking to buy in a navy. We don't have our own shipyards or capabilities, so we're looking for a good, reliable security partner who we can buy a whole lot of ships and submarines from. We've got a whole bunch of money burning a hole in our pocket and a bunch of admirals sitting around with nothing to do, so let's go find a partner to build us some ships and submarines. And the first thing to do is have a look at the market. And let's be clear, military shipbuilding and submarine building is big business in the international arms trade. In terms of systems categories, it's the second largest after aircraft. It's a category which captures countries buying everything from tugboats, patrol vessels, and refueling tankers, all the way up to amphibious assault ships, air defense destroyers, and indeed aircraft carriers. Now, Mr. President, you've probably watched my previous video on the US production advantage, particularly in the aerospace sector, so naturally you conclude that the owner of the world's largest navy is where you want to go in order to buy your ships. And then I put a graph in front of you showing the share of the global arms market for these products that each country has commanded. And no, I didn't stuff that graph up. The graph you've got in front of you shows the percentage share of the trade in ships and submarines, with the blue bar being the years 2001 to 2021, so a 20-year time period, and the orange bar being 2017 to 2021. I present both bars there just because, one, ship sales can be sort of bumpy. It can be distorted by big sales in one particular year, so you generally want to look at more than 1 or 2 years to get an idea of who controls the market. And second, because I want to illustrate some of the big changing patterns over time. But one thing is clear. Over there in the bottom left-hand corner, the USA is feeling pretty lonely, with less than 5% market share over a 20-year time period, dropping even further over the last 5. By contrast, that big blue bar in the middle showing a 20% market share between 2001 and 2021 is Germany. What on earth is going on? And a good place to start might be looking at each of the major producers and seeing how they stack up on some of the elements of competitive advantage, that is, the things that decide whether or not your products are attractive to the market. And there's a lot of things that go in here, but I've pulled out just a couple of critical ones. The first is capability. How good is the stuff that you sell, and what does it allow the countries who buy it to do? If I remodeled a World War II midget submarine and built it using modern techniques, I could have the cheapest submarine on the market, but it wouldn't give anyone particularly much in terms of mission capability. The second element, of course, is cost. If you have the fanciest submarine on the market, but it's 30 times more expensive than its nearest competitor, then no one's going to buy it. At least no one should buy it, barring massive corruption. Which leads into point 3, politics and relationships. As I said before, buying arms from a country is like entering into a long-term relationship. You develop dependency in close relations, which means politics can play a role. What countries do you want to cozy up to in terms of becoming your primary arms supplier? And then finally, I've identified a question around technology transfer and controls. Some countries don't like exporting their best technology, which sort of undermines what they can offer the market. And also, not all countries feel the same way about enabling you to, for example, build their technology under license in your country, building up your own industry, either in competition or in friendship with them. If I'm a country that wants to develop indigenous defense capabilities, I might be willing to pay more for a particular product or accept an inferior one as long as the company selling it to me agrees to do domestic production in my country and to transfer some technology over to me. Scale, manufacturing, technology base, all of these things are useful for informing competitive advantage. It's easier to build more capable systems if you have a better technology and experience base. If you're producing things at scale, it's easier to do them cheaper. But they're not definitive in and of themselves, as we are about to find out. So with those sort of criteria in place, let's have a look at our major competitors. And we're going to start with Russia, or more specifically, we're going to start with the Soviet Union. Now, I think most people tend to think of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union as land powers, not naval powers. And indeed, the naval history of the Russian Empire was spotty and not particularly distinguished. While yes, there were occasional moments of glory, there was also a 1904 incident where a Russian fleet sailing in the North Sea mistook a fleet of British trawlers for Japanese torpedo boats. Yes, Japanese torpedo boats in the North Sea. The Russians fired on the British trawlers, killing some British fishermen, almost starting a war with Great Britain, and also succeeding in causing casualties in the Russian fleet out of friendly fire. Most of those Russian ships would later be put out of their misery at the Battle of Tsushima. But the Russian Navy did have the capacity to build ships. Its last battleships, for example, the Gungut class, had British design yards involved but were primarily built in Russian imperial yards. During World War II, the Soviet Navy, again, had significant shipbuilding capability behind it, but was mostly limited to small ship and submarine actions against the invading Germans. Given that the Soviet Navy ended World War II with relatively limited blue water capabilities, and its new presumptive rival was the United States Navy, it adopted a relatively, shall we say, asymmetric stance in the early Cold War. It accepted that the USN would inevitably be much more powerful, much more capable, and as a result, the focus should be on deploying ships and technologies capable of defending against a much more powerful opponent. But the Soviets were capable of some incredible technical feats all the same. The Alpha-class nuclear submarines, for example, mounted a lead-bismuth reactor, were capable of sustained underwater speeds of about 41 knots, which is 76 kilometers an hour, and had a titanium hull. Using late 1960s technology, the Soviets built a submarine that could not only outrun most of the ships that might be chasing it, but also most of the torpedoes that would be fired at it. Now, were these things horrifically expensive? Yes. Did they cause NATO to massively overreact with a whole bunch of countermeasure and crash research programs in order to counter what they feared to be a massive class of Soviet submarines? Also yes, but it was a very impressive technological achievement, especially for the day. And it proved what Soviet shipbuilding might be capable of if someone took the helm with a bit of, shall we say, ambition, which is where Admiral Sergey Gorshkov enters the picture. Gorshkov was born in Ukraine, raised in Russia, and eventually became the commander of the Soviet Navy. Gorshkov oversaw one of the greatest peacetime naval buildups in history, and it was with the ambition of meeting the United States Navy not as an asymmetric opponent, but as a true peer threat, with the ability to project power globally around the world. With the political leadership on board, the Soviet Union shipbuilding capacity pushed into overdrive, and many of the submarine and ship classes that we associate with the Cold War were designed and launched in Gorshkov's era. And as the Soviets began to build up their own navy, and with it their shipbuilding capacity, their exports to the rest of the socialist or non-aligned world massively increased accordingly. In terms of estimated value, between 1975 and 1979, the Soviet Union exported fewer ships and submarines than the United States did. Between 1980 and 1984, they'd established a narrow but comfortable lead. By 1985 through 89, the Soviets were exporting so many ships and submarines and bits of naval equipment that the gap between them and US exports was larger than all of the vessels in terms of value that the Soviets had exported between 1970 and 1974. The line was going up. The Soviets had found a product that sold, and they were selling them relentlessly. Then the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, and it all went to hell pretty damn quickly. Suddenly, a lot of the Soviet Union's shipyards and suppliers were now in foreign countries. At the same time, the massive reduction in funding to the Soviet military, now the Russian military and the various successor state militaries, was so dramatic and the confusion so great that it led to a series of high-profile accidents, which sort of undermined the perception of Russian technology. Shipyards also struggled. There were no longer bumper military orders reliably funded year after year from the central budget. Instead, it was now a battle to retain workers, cut wages, and just survive. In 85 to 89, the Soviet Union had far outstripped the USA in terms of exports of ships and submarines. By 1990 to 94, they were exporting half what the Americans were, and basically it wasn't getting any better in 1995 through 1999. But the raw materials of a good shipbuilding sector were still there. People still remembered the skills they had learnt during the days of the Soviet Union. Some of the workers were still employed, and even those that were no longer employed could potentially be rehired. The capital equipment was still mostly there, and the designs that they'd inherited from the Soviet Union, while not always world beaters, were probably good enough for some buyers. And that set the stage for something of a resurgence. In the 2000s, Russian industry got up, brushed itself off, and went back to work. Old Soviet-era designs that were still competitive had upgrade packages applied and started to be marketed again. Shipyards refurbished themselves, got a little more funding, and started putting their products out competitively for tender to other countries. Now, most of these offerings were modified Soviet designs, but highly cost competitive. The Tolwa design that went to India, for example, is basically a Krivak 3 derivative. It's a Soviet design with a fresh coat of paint and some upgrades, but it's cost competitive and still relatively capable, so there was a real market for it. At the same time, Russia started to solve the international border problem. Connections were re-established with shipyards and various companies in countries like Ukraine to enable Russian industry to offer ships with subsystems that were sourced elsewhere. It was a recipe that, in terms of market success, led to a massive renaissance for the Russian shipbuilding sector. Between 2010 and 2014, Russia was the largest single exporter of military ships and submarines in the world, with nearly 30% of the market. And they really were good years. Between 2010 to 2014, Russia booked the sale of or delivered a whole bunch of submarines or warships. The Kilo-class submarines were a particularly good seller. 6 of them went to Vietnam, 2 of them went to Algeria, and then in terms of frigates, 3 of the Tolwa-class frigates went to India,
2 Gepard 3 frigates went to Vietnam. This is not a complete list, by the way, this is just a sample. And in perhaps the most high-profile delivery, the old aircraft carrier Admiral Gorshkov was refurbished and sold to India as the INS Vikramaditya. The money was flowing in, infrastructure could be refurbished, key talent retained, and Russia's ambition to grow the number of classes of warships and submarines that it was producing, and which it was offering on the open market, was only growing. But I bet you all know why I cut this period off at 2014. The annexation of Crimea was a disaster for Russian naval exports. Russian shipbuilders were now suddenly cut off from imports of critical foreign components, of which they had used many. In particular, they were cut off from supplies coming out of Ukraine. Funny that. Remember, one of the problems that the Russians had to solve after the breakup of the Soviet Union was re-establishing connections with industries in countries like Ukraine in order to get more of the Soviets' infrastructure operating again. All of us probably know the Slava-class cruisers, mostly because we know the ship Moskva, which was the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet until it was sunk in this current war. The great irony, of course, is that Moskva was born in Ukraine. She was launched as Slava from the Mykolaiv shipyards. With the loss of access to critical imports from Ukraine and elsewhere abroad, there would still be sales, but there would now be production bottlenecks, servicing issues, sustainment challenges, and cost concerns that would impact the Russian shipbuilding sector, and market share would go with it. Between 2010 and 2014, the Russians had 30% market share. For 2015 to 21, it was 7.6%, putting them behind the mighty naval power of the Netherlands. So, Mr. President, what do the Russians offer us as a potential supplier of naval hardware? Well, one thing to say is that Russian technology has generally remained pretty cost competitive, though import restrictions do raise reliability and cost issues going forward. There are risks if we engage with the Russians, for example, that there may be delays resulting from them trying to substitute imported components or dealing with industrial bottlenecks. That said, their domestic shipbuilding does seem to continue apace, which suggests a certain degree of industrial ruggedness, or at the very least, a lot of stockpiled supplies and a degree of industrial autarky. In terms of their underlying design, well, Russian warships tend to have quite high degrees of firepower compared to other warships of similar tonnage, because they're capable of mounting the dizzying array of Russian cruise and hypersonic anti-ship and ground attack missile systems. And so far as their submarine go, well, systems like Kilo are really well understood, their performance characteristics are well known, and there are a lot of countries out there that operate them, have spare parts, so you know what's going to be involved in maintaining them. We know that long term there's probably going to be some challenges for Russian shipbuilding industry. The reincorporation of the Mykolaiv and the other Ukrainian yards that would really help doesn't really seem likely at this juncture, nor does renewed access to foreign technology. So really the attractiveness of Russia as a potential supplier is probably tied up in how the Russian-Ukrainian war ends. If the war had ended in 3 days and the Russians had managed to absorb most of Ukraine's military-industrial complex, then there would have been real room, if there were no sanctions in place, for Russia to continue to be, and indeed resurge, as a major ship and submarine exporter. But as we all know, the war didn't end in 3 days. So if we can't buy from the Russians, Mr. President, well, what about the Americans? After all, the history of US ship and submarine building is impossible to challenge. In 1938, the United States had 5 aircraft carriers. In 1944, it had 90, 25 fleet carriers and 65 escort carriers. It had gone from 54 submarines to 230. It had gone from 159 surface warships of all types to 827. And that's not even taking account of the truly ungodly amount of merchant ship tonnage that American shipyards were able to produce during the Second World War, thanks to the vision of industrialists like Henry Kaiser. The US, over the course of World War II, exploded from being a major naval power to de facto unchallenged on the world's oceans. The German and Japanese navies were at the bottom of the ocean or surrendered. The British Royal Navy was small by comparison to its American ally, and the country behind it, Britain, was essentially bankrupt. With the empire fraying at the edges and the exchequer empty, there were more important priorities than keeping battleships and aircraft carriers in His Majesty's service. And so the flag of dominant naval power that had for so long rested with the United Kingdom passed peacefully and unchallenged to the United States. And so it has largely remained for more than 70 years at this point. While the Soviet Union did build up to become a peer rival during the late 70s and the 80s, overall the United States has maintained a pretty unchallenged array of capabilities, the vast majority of the world's nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, escort ships, nuclear submarines, and ballistic missile submarines that give the US an incredible power projection capacity. And all of that huge fleet of surface and submersible warships you'd imagine, has to be sustained by one of the world's most impressive military shipbuilding industries. Surely you think that would be reflected in sales abroad. But then you look at the graph and start to get very confused. Between 1970 and 1974, the US commanded more than 35% of the global export market. It peaked again in 1990 to 94 with about 30%, but in 2015 to 21, the figure had dropped well below 5%, making the US a relatively minor player in the shipping export market. What on earth was going on? The first issue is that America has something of a product problem. The United States Navy is a pretty big customer, so it shouldn't surprise anyone to hear that American shipbuilding is basically geared to supplying what the US Navy wants and has been buying for decades. Unfortunately for export prospects, what the United States Navy needs and what more ordinary countries and more ordinary navies need are very different things. If you think about the ship classes for which the USN is famous, the ones that they have built more of than anyone else, the ones that they've got very good at building and established some competitive advantage in relation to, well, you're going to think about the big supercarriers, the CVNs, or you're going to think about the American submarine fleet. Now, American bubbleheads don't slum it with diesel engines. It's nuclear boats all the way. Personally, I like to imagine that the executives at places like Newport News, that builds a lot of America's nuclear submarines, keep pictures of Hyman Rickover in their office to thank him for committing America so heavily to the idea of a nuclear navy. So America gets really, really good at building nuclear submarines, SSNs, SSBNs, SSGNs, and of course the ever larger and ever more capable supercarriers. Unfortunately, there's a relatively shallow pool of countries that are willing to buy this sort of equipment, and an even narrower pool of countries that the United States will be willing to sell to. For a navy that might only be interested in anti-piracy patrols, defending its coastline, and maybe some covert submarine surveillance, dropping $14 billion on a Gerald R. Ford class CVN might be a little bit of overkill. And if, for example, Beijing were to try to put in an order for a couple of Virginia-class submarines, I imagine the Americans would say a very polite no, go back to their offices, and then laugh. A lot of these platforms are packed to the gills with top-secret technology, and America is not exactly keen to export them or give them away. Plus, they're usually expensive overkill for the requirements that most nations face. Compare this, for example, to something like F-35 or F-16 in the aerospace sector. Most nations need an aircraft to be able to defend their airspace. Most nations with serious military capabilities want to also have a ground attack capability. They need a multi-role jet. If the budget only stretches so far, F-16 is a good answer. If you want something more capable, stealthy, and future-proof, well, F-35 is a good answer. Now, whether you're in Europe, in South America, in Southeast Asia, it doesn't really matter. Most nations have fighter jets, but very, very few have 100,000-ton supercarriers. In fact, precisely one does. The Chinese are getting closer with ships like the Fujian, but that's an 80,000-ton diesel-powered carrier, not a 100,000-ton nuclear one. So from an export perspective, America is left in the uncomfortable position of having gotten very good at building products that no one else needs or wants. And then there's the challenge of capacity and cost. And Americans, I've said enough nice things about your industry in the past that I hope you'll let me get away with this. US civilian shipbuilding is an extremely hollowed out sector. It struggles with cost, skill retention, and capacity. I won't dive into the Jones Act too much because that probably verges on politics, but suffice to say that the United States isn't really a big player in the civilian shipbuilding sector anymore. And while civilian shipbuilding is distinct from military shipbuilding, the US certainly does build warships and nuclear submarines, not having a civil sector to back it up weakens the base of skills and supporting industries that you can otherwise lean on in order to keep costs down and enable you to scale up in an emergency. Then there's just the problem of US military shipyards suffering from a general lack of capacity. In 2020, as the service was dealing with maintenance backlogs and capacity shortfalls, Vice Admiral Galinas had to stand up before the House Armed Services Committee and say that the service was seriously looking at how much money it would need to accelerate its planned roughly $20 billion 20-year term overhaul of the United States military shipbuilding infrastructure, namely the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Plan. Now, $20 billion is already a lot of money, but some commentators looking at the current plan have suggested that even if everything went perfectly, The plan, as conceived, wouldn't be sufficient even to support a United States Navy at its current size in certain capability areas, let alone allow for an expanding one. In part, the problem is that United States ships and submarines have gotten better and bigger far quicker than the dockyards have. In one report I was able to find, there was a claim that 17 dry docks in the United States could service Los Angeles-class nuclear submarines, only 12 could fit the Virginia class that replaced them, and only 7 could fit the latest version, which is the Virginia class with the additional payload module. Fewer dry docks means less maintenance capability, means there's a greater odds that at any given time you might have a submarine that is waiting for maintenance but isn't fit to be in service. Now, the Navy obviously knows this, but nonetheless it poses a problem for any export potential. Namely that you're always going to match orders for the United States Navy and the Coast Guard first. Let's just say an allied country, be it a NATO nation or a major non-NATO allied country, comes along and says, hey, we'd really like a nuclear submarine or a frigate or a corvette or something. If you don't have the shipyard capacity to fit the USN's orders, you're going to have to say no to that request. It doesn't matter how much money the ally has to put up. It doesn't matter what strategic imperative is in place. It doesn't matter that Congress or the Pentagon have signed off on any technology transfer requirements and said, yes, this is a good idea. If the shipyards don't have the capacity, you can't make the sale. And that's something that's going to be holding the United States back going forward. Now, when you take that argument and couple with the graph that I showed you earlier of sales going down over time, you might think that's enough analysis, problem solved. The infrastructure has decayed, therefore they can't make any sales. Well, about that decline, let's dig a little bit deeper. Because it's easy to say that this graph shows a decline from a 35% market share in the early 70s to less than 5% in 1915 to 21. But look very carefully at where those spikes in sales are. 1970 to 1974 and 1990 to 1994, with sales often being very heavy in the following years as well. Funny how those correspond with periods where the United States Navy shed a tremendous number of ships. 1970 to 1974 is the post-Vietnam drawdown coupled with the emergence of Détente. In 1970, the United States Navy had 743 active ships, of which 249 were warships. By 1975, the number had dropped overall to 559 and 193 warships. Jump forward to 1989, and the United States Navy was coming off a high from Reagan's military buildup and was ready for a punch-up with the Soviet Union. It had 592 active ships and 212 active warships. Then the Soviet Union collapsed and the USN decided that maybe its existing force structure was, overkill. Hilarious, gratuitous overkill. So the Navy shrunk. From 592 ships in 1989, it was down to 392 by 1995 and 344 by 1998. 212 warships became, by 1996, 123. And funnily enough, these massive drawdowns in US Navy strength correlated with years where America did really, really good work in the export numbers. Uncle Sam wasn't just throwing old ships away, some would be scrapped for certain, but the reality is, America wasn't really big in the late Cold War era or the early 2000s on selling new build ships. No. America was a second-hand dealer. Because while American warships may be overspec'd and overcosted for what most nations need most of the time, suddenly they're a heck of a lot more attractive if they're being sold for cents on the dollar. Now on the screen there, I've got an extract from SIPRI's Arm Transfer Database. This is a partial list of all ships and submarines that the United States has transferred abroad that SIPRI has tracked. And as you can see, I've highlighted every instance on that extract of the words second-hand or produced under license, and it applies to just about every line for those figures that you're looking at in the 1990s or the early 2000s. In the late 1990s, Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates were going to the Egyptians, who called it the Mubarak class, for about $55 million a ship. Which makes me think that all those oligarchs with their yachts got this wrong. Why spend $100 or $150 million on a super yacht when you could instead buy a small fleet of warships? I imagine the officials coming to confiscate them would have been a little more careful if the oligarchs had been packing some 76mm guns. Anyway, the point is finding pure new build ships in the US export catalogue is a lot harder than with other nations. Instead, what tends to happen is when the United States Navy retires vessels that still have some useful life left in them, they tend to be sold second-hand or given away as aid instead, thus driving up the American numbers. Yes, there were the Elat-class frigates that were built in the 1990s, but that was the exception, not the rule. And so if this is the primary driver of US exports, then it's not surprising the number is tending to go down in recent years. The United States Navy hasn't done any major shedding of surface ships in large numbers in recent years, especially not of vessels that still have significant remaining useful service life that other nations might be interested in buying. If the Navy is relatively stable in size and running ships mostly towards the end of their useful lives or upgrading them instead, well, there's a limited supply of stuff to sell, which means the American export numbers go down. So really what I'm saying is that American export dealings haven't suffered as much of a decline as the graph might suggest. Instead, America's just run out of second-hand shit to sell. The advanced, expensive products that it produces for its Navy are great for its Navy, but it's at capacity trying to meet the USN's need anyway, and there's limited fat in the budget or in the shipyard sector to provide affordable export sales for countries overseas. In other words, Mr. President, if we're looking for an export partner, the United States may not be it. Now, that's not to say the US doesn't have an awful lot to offer, especially when you consider the technology base that some of its big prime contractors have. The US, if it's willing to, can offer immense amounts of technology transfer and know-how to help our own shipbuilding efforts, or to cooperate with whatever prime contractors you engage to build your nation's fleet. They also have an absolute lock on the weapons systems market. Whatever sort of warship you build and whoever you get to build it, the chances are there's going to be some US-built missile systems on board the vessel in order to give it some firepower. But for the most part, what America builds probably isn't what you need to buy, the costs are high, and the capacity to fit in your deliveries are relatively low. So while our country might want to pursue NATO or major non-NATO ally status to make sure that if the United States Navy ever does have some second-hand ships they're willing to sell off, that we might be able to get a bargain, they're probably not a good choice for a primary provider, which leads us looking for a new one. And it's now I get to find out if I have any German fans left after my video on the Bundeswehr. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to talk about Europe. Now, it's no secret that Europe is home to many historical or traditional naval powers. The United Kingdom was the dominant naval power in the world for centuries. It's where we get the phrase Britannia rules the waves. And its primary rivals were usually other European powers. For a very, 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 very long time, it was either France, Spain, or both. And then eventually Germany would take the cake with the naval build-up leading up to the First World War. And then there's Italy and the Dutch. Italy was a major player in the Mediterranean, not just for all the years after its reunification, but even in its various components before unification. The history of the Venetian Navy, for example, or the fact that parts of what are now Italy provided a lot of the sailors and personnel that went into the Austro-Hungarian Navy. The Netherlands, the Dutch, they got wealthy by building a global maritime trade empire, which obviously needed some firepower in order to defend it. Of course, European nations are no longer in the business of building fleets the size of Britain's Grand Fleet prior to World War I, for example. The capacity of their shipyards has greatly diminished from its heyday, but they still retain some specialist skills and some very high-tech producers. There's a limited number of nations out there that can build specialised large warships, like diesel-powered carriers or nuclear submarines. A number of them are in Europe, and that makes them worth looking at as a potential export provider. Between 2001 and 2021, more than half of global warships and submarine exports by value came out of 5 EU nations. Sorry UK, I'm leaving you aside for a moment because you decided to leave. Now, I do want a video on European defence industry to be its own separate thing, but just in the space of shipbuilding, it's important to consider these EU nations. In the public conception, Germany is the Panzer nation. They're the nation that builds tanks and armoured vehicles. They're the guys behind the Leopard, the Marder, the Gepard. Well, in terms of raw value, Germany isn't really an armoured vehicle manufacturing nation, it's a submarine and shipbuilding nation. Between 2001 and 2021, Germany accounted for 20% of global warship and submarine exports, as determined by SIPRI Trend Indicator Value. France had about 12.3%, Spain had 7.7%, the Netherlands 7.6%, and Italy 4.9%. Collectively, they accounted for a greater share in warship and submarine exports than the United States did in aircraft sales. And if you do add back in the United Kingdom, then things get even more clear-cut. And one potential driver of this major disparity is the offerings that these European shipyards put to the market. Because European firms offer a dizzying array of corvettes and frigates, other surface warships, submarines, and auxiliary vessels for sale. And I think if I take you through some of the national sales records, you'll start to see a theme pretty quickly. In Germany, the flagship products tend to be frigates and submarines. In the submarine market, TKMS is the big market player, with a variety of models, including some that were designed entirely for export. In terms of industrial concerns, Germany's got a variety of things that it's quite good at. It's good at building diesel engines, it's good at metallurgy, it's good at chemistry. You put those things together and you can build a pretty quiet, pretty reliable submarine most of the time. And in terms of orientation, the German defense sector, particularly when it comes to military shipbuilding, is really more externally focused than internally focused. Germany only has 6 submarines, but between 2017 and 2021, it's sold several times that number. In terms of licensed production, the Type 212 went to Italy and Norway. 4 Type 218s went to Singapore with some local components in Singapore and some construction in Germany. 12 Type 214s went to the Republic of Korea and Turkey, in both cases licensed production agreements. There were 4 Type 209s to Egypt, and Israel got the Dolphin and the Decay class. I could go on. The point is that while US shipyards are busy building for the United States Navy, the German military-industrial complex survives by virtue of entering into licensed production agreements or just straight export agreements with countries abroad. There are far more German frigates, for example, in service with countries like Brazil and Egypt and Israel than there are with the German Navy. And while some customers have occasionally had complaints, well, customers often do, and TKMS continues to be a relatively powerful market actor. The French naval group operates in a similar sort of space, diesel-electric submarines, frigates, but also in the French case, one of their differentiating factors is that they're willing to enter into the nuclear propulsion area. France has partnered with Brazil and is intending to produce a nuclear submarine there in the early 2030s, the Alvaro Alberto. Given the relative strength of France's civil nuclear industry and the relatively low number of countries capable of building nuclear submarines, Naval Group tries to advance itself as one of the natural partners for any country trying to move into the nuclear propulsion game. And then, of course, there are the Go-In type frigates. These have been sold or delivered or had orders booked or discussed for countries as far afield as the UAE, Malaysia, and Egypt. But in terms of dollar figures, it's hard to move past the French submarine offering. Their main diesel-electric type is actually a co-development between Naval Group and Navantia in Spain, who we will talk about in a moment, and these things are in operation as far afield as India, where they have been domestically produced under license. And it's by this point, only 2 nations in, that you might have started to notice a bit of a theme that brings an earlier point home. When Turkey decided to buy submarines from Germany, they entered into a contract with TKMS for about 2 billion euros. 2 billion euros was enough to buy 6 Type 214 conventional submarines. Each submarine would displace around 2,000 tons, have an armament of 8 torpedo tubes, and have about 30 people on board. By comparison, the Americans were off building the Virginia class. With its payload module, which is a recent upgrade which adds an additional midsection to the Virginia-class nuclear submarine so it can carry more ordnance, the cost per boat has gone well north of $3 billion US. The things displace 10,000 tons and have an armament of 65 cruise missiles and torpedoes and a complement of 135. The products just cannot be compared. The Type 214 is a relatively expensive, small vessel that is well suited for operating in areas like the Mediterranean. The Virginia is a Pacific predator, a vessel built for incredible endurance thanks to its nuclear reactor, as well as packing an incredibly large payload, including a large amount of cruise and standoff munitions. And while I'm sure there are some Turks out there that would love to see their nation cruise something the size of a Virginia in the Black Sea or the Mediterranean, the reality is the entire Turkish submarine budget for those 6 Type 214s wouldn't purchase you a single Block 5 Virginia, even if the United States A agreed to sell it to you, and B could find a shipyard with the spare capacity to produce and deliver it before 2057. European products, European specializations, just tend to be cheaper and more accessible, and as a result, on the shopping list of a wider range of countries. And while the Virginia is obviously impressive, it's not like Allied diesel submarines like the Australian Collins class haven't scored some major victories against the United States Navy during war games. Just because it's smaller, lighter, and cheaper doesn't mean it can't be deadly in the right hands. Spain's state-owned shipbuilder has already gotten a call out when we were talking about France. This is Navantia.
Navantia is, as I said, a state-owned major player that's operating in both the civil and military sectors, so they've got some economies of scale from their civil business to help support the military business. Some big recent sales between 2017 and 21, 5 Avante 2200 type frigates went to Saudi Arabia, and there was licensed production for a cost of about 1.5 billion euros in the overall program for the Anadolu class assault ship that was produced in Turkey. Also out of interest, a Navantia design was the basis of the Hobart class air warfare destroyers that were produced in Australia. And then there's Italy. Now, Italy is home to what I believe is Europe's largest shipbuilder, Fincantieri, but they're mostly associated, I think, in the public imagination, not with warships, but with cruise liners, with enjoyment and fun. It's Italy. But of course, they're a major shipbuilding firm with a large business, so they also dabble in the warship market. They've got a reasonable tonnage capacity because of that large civil-military sector cross, and Italy does have a native advantage in certain warship weapon systems. So the market for exporting weapons to go on ships is regarded as a separate market to the ships themselves, and Italy has a disproportionate share of that market. In terms of major products that have gone out in recent years, Italy does have a joint frigate design with Naval Group in France. This is the FREM frigate, the Fregata Europea Multimissione. So 2 of those went to Egypt and 6 of those went to Indonesia. And there was also a €4 billion deal for 4 Al-Zubarah class ships that went to Qatar in 2016. Not went to Qatar, was signed in 2016. Now, as far as I know, no customer has asked Fincantieri to leverage its experience in the 2 different sides of the market yet by, say, installing a swimming pool or a casino on any of the warships offered, which I think is a real missed opportunity, but nowhere near as bad as the missed opportunity of not taking up their experience to install like a 76mm gun on a cruise ship. Because imagine the fun that passengers could have if one of the activities is, you throw target buoys over the side, and occasionally passengers, for a little bit extra, could take turns trying to pop the targets with the 76mm. I reckon it would do gangbusters business, and, pirates would no longer be interested. Now, is that flagrantly illegal? Yes, of course it is flagrantly illegal, but I stand by the concept. And then, rounding out our EU5, we have the Netherlands. The Netherlands does have a bit of a different niche to the other EU nations. Their niche is building small. They do have some frigate sales, which you'll see on their trade register if you choose to download it, but you'll also see lots and lots of entries for Damen Group, who are responsible for providing what seems like half of planet Earth with patrol boats, tugs, and small ships. This means that the Netherlands is really active in the Coast Guard and coastal defense space. When you see US Coast Guard cutters, a family of which are built in Louisiana, well, they're largely based on a Dutch Damen design. The Dutch trade register is admittedly complicated by the way SIPRI classifies things. Damen builds an awful lot of its ships outside the Netherlands, but then again, a lot of nations get credit for licensed production overseas, so this case is no different. And like many other European nations, the Dutch are willing to get into the technology transfer, licensed production, or joint production game. When they built a number of ships for Indonesia, for example, some of the modules were built in Indonesia, some of them were built in the Netherlands, and they were combined in Indonesia. Not an unusual production technique, but one to call out because it involves cooperating and building up the capability of the nation you're selling to, while at the same time retaining some production back at home, usually for the more advanced or technically difficult components and segments. So that's a roundup of the EU5, but it isn't really the entire picture because, and not to preempt my European defence video too much, but the key is a lot of European naval offerings are integrated offerings. Because while I've talked about Germany exporting a ship or France exporting a ship, the reality is, especially for ships produced in Europe, although this is generally a global phenomenon to an extent, very few ships get all of their subsystems and components from the one country. And when you're in Europe, that relationship is even tighter than it is when you're not dealing with boundaries within NATO and within the EU. So hypothetically, for example, you could produce a frigate that had German MTU diesel engines, because we know how the Germans feel about diesel. It could have an Italian OTO Melara 76mm main gun, which is one of the most common for so many years primary weapon systems for surface warfare ships. OTO Melara is now part of Leonardo, by the way, the big Italian prime contractor. It could have a Dutch-built radar and search system. It could have Franco-Italian torpedoes. If there's a helicopter pad on the back, then the helicopter is probably joint produced by Airbus, Leonardo, and Fokker all together. And then because at the end of the day, you do have to outsource some components to the Americans, it could mount American-built Standard Missile-2 systems. Only that's not a hypothetical. That's the German Sachsen-class frigate. So from an export perspective, If you're looking to buy a ship or a submarine from a European nation, it doesn't necessarily need to be the case that the country you're buying from has all the necessary capabilities to be a market leader. It can sometimes be enough that another EU NATO nation is a tech leader and is willing to provide their subsystem and integrate it into a multinational project. Now again, this is not a phenomenon unique to Europe, but it's certainly much more pronounced in Europe than it is in, say, ships built in the United States. So what does Europe offer overall? European yards generally have pretty strong offerings, they've got a strong tech base, and they tend to produce vessels, whether they're surface combatants or submarines, that tend to be at the lighter end of the market. They produce corvettes, they produce frigates, they produce small diesel-electric AIP submarines. And if you're outfitting a navy for most countries, lighter diesel submarines, frigates, corvettes, coastal patrol vessels, those sort of things can carry you a long way. There's also industrial capability in some of these countries to go bigger. France is a nuclear market power, so if you are interested in something larger, like an amphibious assault ship or something with nuclear propulsion, there's probably a European prime contractor that you can go to and they can outsource the components that they can't produce themselves. So the integrated offerings that come out of Europe have tremendous potential to be quite competitive. And they've got some very advanced models in development. France currently has the FDI program. The Germans also have some modern surface ships, although I'm not sure how proud they are of the Baden-Württemberg. It's had a little bit of a rough time entering service. It was a bit overweight when it came out. But either way, you've got some relatively modern, hypothetically very capable designs that are coming out there. Although I have to admit, it is very German to build the heaviest frigate in the world and fit it with a variety of non-lethal countermeasures like water cannons, but not be able to find any room for an offensive vertical launch missile system, unlike just about every other frigate on the market. But ultimately that just comes down to the mission that the ships were designed to do, and it doesn't detract in any way from what Europe can offer countries as a potential export partner when it comes to ships and submarines. Which leads us to the final country that I wanted to talk about today. And for this last section, we're travelling all the way from Europe to Asia, to the Republic of Korea. That's the southern one for anyone who wasn't sure. And before I talk about modern Korea's industrial capabilities, I thought it was important to put them in perspective and how remarkable their existence is. Because the Republic of Korea ended the Korean War with a very underdeveloped economy, significant casualties. It was basically wrecked from end to end. It had been invaded, partially occupied, and then liberated. But after the war, economic development followed at a breakneck pace. In 1961, the GDP per capita of the Republic of Korea was $91, 34 times smaller than the United States to use World Bank figures. By 1981, it was up to 1,883 in Korea, which had narrowed the gap between them and the United States 27 times. In 2021, the GDP per capita was 34,758, approximately half of what it was in the United States. Truly a breathtaking pace of economic development. And it should be noted that not only did this economic growth lead to an increase in prosperity in the country, it also created some massive mega corporations that dominate individual industries in South Korea. You may have heard of some of them, we'll talk about them in a moment. This is also a country with a strong naval tradition. If you know Admiral Nelson or Sir Francis Drake, then you really should know about Admiral Yi Sun-sin and look up his battles against the Japanese. Of course, that history had to go into hibernation for a very, very long time while Korea was occupied, and then obviously in the years immediately following the Korean War, there wasn't exactly resources available to go and build a blue water navy. So in its early days, the Republic of Korea largely fielded a coastal navy stocked with US-built vessels. But from there was a steady transition, first to a domestically built and largely coastal and brown water navy, then an evolution to a green water navy, and then in recent years a blue water navy where Korea is capable of sending ships long distances from its shores in order to make its will known in international affairs or participate in international anti-piracy patrols. There was even ambition to get Korea into the aircraft carrier game with something called the CVX program, which was intended to deliver a domestically built aircraft carrier carrying F-35s made in America. Now, in recent years, the funding to make that happen just hasn't been there. The priority has been deterrence against North Korea, but who knows what the future holds for Korea's blue water naval ambitions. And if you want to talk about the shipbuilding sector that will support those ambitions, well, it's time to talk about Korea's truly massive shipbuilding output and the big three. Because in modern times, the vast majority of civil ship tonnage is produced in Asia. Not in Europe, not in America, it's produced in Asia, in a three-way competition between Korea, Japan, and the People's Republic of China. Now, those markets do partially but not fully overlap. For example, Korean shipbuilders tend to focus more on high value-added designs like LNG tankers, while China has a dominance in more basic container ship design. The point is that the quantities in terms of tonnage produced in Korea are massive, and they are driven overwhelmingly by the big three. Hyundai Heavy Industries, who have a mega facility Ulsan, for example, Samsung Heavy Industries, and Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering. Now, civilian shipbuilding isn't military shipbuilding, I acknowledge that, but a strong civil sector is an amazing base to support military shipbuilding. A strong civilian shipbuilding sector means you're going to have an awful lot of dockyards. You're going to have a lot of people used to working on ships. You're going to have a whole bunch of individuals with the right trade skills and marine engineers. Yes, you might not have the right supply of weapons integration technicians, for example, but a lot of the industrial base and a lot of the skills you need are going to be there supporting the civilian sector. And the civil sector in Korea dwarfs that of the United States or of Europe. And so in that context, it's probably not surprising that Korea has become a growing export provider in the military shipbuilding space. And that makes sense considering that in many ways this country's got some pretty strong advantages. It's got immense amounts of industrial capital in the shipbuilding sector, a strong population of human capital, people who understand what it takes in order to build vessels, and at the same time has salary rates that are lower than the United States or Europe, which helps bring down costs. The Koreans also tend to be fairly open to the ideas of technology transfer, licensed or local production when it comes to defense exports. We've seen this in armored vehicles as well, and if I do a video on armored vehicle exports, you'll see that theme again and again. Or if we talk about Poland and their recent buying spree. So you have a nation that can compete on things like cost and construction capability, while at the same time being pretty open in how it does its tech transfer and other dealings. But if it has a drawback, it's that the technology base for warships specifically really isn't there entirely yet. To illustrate this point, if you look at the table in the top right, which is a trade register or an extract of a trade register for exports from South Korea in terms of warships and submarines since 2011, there are some standout items there, like the Type 209/1400 submarines that went to Indonesia. Except the Type 209/1400 is originally a German design. So Daewoo is adapting a German design, it's licensing in a German design, adapting it, and then either constructing it domestically or entering into agreements with other countries in order to produce them domestically in their countries. It's a company and a country that is still in learning mode, but has a tremendous amount of potential in front of it. So I thought Korea deserved a call-out, both as a rising power in the arms export sector, but also as a country where the industrial fundamentals seem very, very strong. Good human capital base, massive civil sector that can support the military construction sector, and a relatively cost-competitive wage environment. It's a good environment for potential future growth, particularly in the Asian market. So, Mr. President, if we are in the market, it might be worth giving a miss to Moscow or Washington and instead making a trip to Seoul. To conclude, while the United States and China may have the largest and most powerful navies in the world, they have domestic shipbuilding sectors which are largely key to producing ships for themselves rather than for the export market. When it comes to exports, it's not the US or China or Russia that is the major export power, it's European Union countries and the ROK that are much larger actors in that space. Russia suffers from a lack of access to foreign yards and components since 2014 and slowly obsoleting designs that are desperately in need of a refresh. The USA has shipyard issues, it's not configured to produce systems for foreign buyers, and it's usually been a second-hand seller anyway. By contrast, the EU and Korea fill gaps for advanced small submarines, corvettes, frigates, coastal patrol vessels, and other ships that most buyers out there are likely to be interested in. The PRC, as I flagged before, wasn't mentioned deeply in this video because they're largely focused on domestic production for the People's Liberation Army Navy. So when I look at Chinese capability growth in the future, I will give some time to the Chinese shipbuilding sector. I'll also close out with a caveat. Recall that export share is not equivalent to total production. Just because I'm saying the EU and ROK are big players in the export market, that doesn't mean they are the dominant military shipbuilders. The USN and the PLAN still dominate massively on tonnage counts, which means the US military-industrial complex for shipbuilding is far larger and more capable than the European or the Korean sectors that I've talked about today. The difference is it is targeted internally and as a result has a relatively limited presence on the export market. America may dominate global aviation markets with F-16, F-15, and F-35, but so far as shipbuilding goes, the final customer is usually American. Okay, channel update to close out. This video was originally going to be a 7-month update on the battlefield side of the war in Ukraine, but for those of you who are watching the news, you may have noticed some fairly rapid developments in Ukraine over the last several days, so I've got that update on hold for at least a week to allow the current situation to clarify itself and to allow me to verify some of the information that's coming out. The global arms trade was a winning patron topic, so I thought that this was the best one to jump to the front of the queue and to fill this week's slot. In terms of channel objectives, this week's objectives haven't been anything exciting in terms of Discord or whatever. It's been about getting ahead. It's been about producing slide packs and doing the research for the next several topics to make sure that I have material on hand. And my basic goal here is to give subtitlers and translators a bit of a break. What I'm doing at the moment is I'm releasing a video and then turning it over to the subtitlers and translators, because the video gets finished and then it gets published almost immediately. If I'm a week ahead, I can give an unlisted version to translators and subtitlers, which means when the video goes up, it's already available with subtitles and indeed in multiple languages. So that has been the goal for this week, and I've made a lot of progress on that point. I should be at least 1 week ahead from now on. I will offer my apologies again for delaying the update on Ukraine. I just thought that accuracy and verification was probably more important than speculation. There's a lot of that out there already. So just giving me those extra 7 days to work with will give me greater confidence that what I'm presenting to you is at least well evidenced. Thank you very much for your patience as always, and I'll see you again next week.